Namaste, bonjour, shalom. I'm pleased to welcome three exceptional young Indian authors today, Brisha Jain, Nyasa Khare, and Anushka Dhar. Brisha is a 16-year-old student in Kolkata. Her book, The Year That Wasn't, Diary of a 14-year-old, is based on her chronicle of life leading up to and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Nyasa, who's only 12 years old, hails from Gurugram, that's Gurgaon, and now lives in Berkeley, California, where she is a student in class 7th. She's the author of the book, My Friend, NS230 and Other Stories, a collection of short stories. Anushka is an 18-year-old film student at New York University's Tisch School of Arts. Her book, NH44, Take Me Home, is about the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits from their ancestral homeland, a topic about which most Indians continue to know very little. Brisha, Nyasa, and Anushka, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I will start with some questions and I will ask that each of you answer them in order. After a few questions from me, we will open the floor for questions from the audience on live video. In the meantime, I will ask the audience to keep their microphones on mute. We invite the audience to use the chat box at any time to comment or ask questions. Brisha, Nyasa, and Anushka, do you have any questions before we start?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So I have read the books that you wrote, and I am very impressed with what you wrote, especially at your young age. But this video will be available for people to watch in posterity. So could we start with a 30 to 40-second elevator pitch of your book? How would you describe it to someone who's not read it when they watch this video? Anushka, we can start with you and go with Brisha and then Nyasa.
All right. So the book I wrote is called NH44, Take Me Home. And as you said, it's about the Kashmir Pandit exodus. I would argue that it's more about the Kashmir Pandit story as a whole, because while we do focus on the exodus in the book, it talks about the violence that led up, the violence and persecution that led up to the exodus that the Kashmir Pandits endured in Kashmir. It talks about the resettlement phase that was incredibly difficult for my community. And it just generally focuses on how their story as a community was a story of hope as opposed to a story of trauma and pain.
Brisha?
Right. So my book is titled The Year That Wasn't, and it's for anyone who wants to understand what we as a society have gone through in the year 2020 through the eyes of teenagers. So people of my age will find their story in it, and other adults will find a perspective of the pandemic that is refreshing. My book is a journal-style narrative, and in short, it's about the hopeful beginning of a new decade, the confusion of the worldwide calamity, to a death march that wouldn't halt, to coping with online schooling, a digital divide, the vaccine race, and the fading away of the pandemic, and again, its resurgence.
Wonderful. Nyasa?
So my book is a collection of 10 short stories based on the themes of love for the environment, love of family, fun, and tensions of school life, and other contemporary issues like the Ukraine war, for example. People of all ages will be able to connect with my stories. Anybody who is interested in the present and the future of humanity will love my book.
Wonderful. So now all three of you mentioned sort of hope or, some positive themes as you described your book. As I read the books, they were also about trauma and whether it was about the Kashmiri Pandits or whether it was about COVID or whether it was about sort of what the future will look like, the first story in Nyasa's book. So as authors, do you think that the theme of hope is better than the theme of trauma, I guess?
I think at least for my book, my aim was to, highlight or emphasize the trauma that the Kashmiri Pandits went through, because I think that's an integral part of their story. But it was also important for me to reiterate the fact that the trauma doesn't overshadow the hope, because I think in all three of our books, the idea of resiliency and the idea of rising above challenges and triumphing is something that's present. And I feel like that was applicable to the Kashmiri Pandits community as well. And I also feel like we could use a little more positivity in the world, so it doesn't hurt to focus on the hope while also shedding light on, on the trauma and the challenges.
Wonderful. Vishal, Nyasa, do you have any thoughts?
I feel like for my book, what applies is that when we look back at the year 2020, all we think about is the pandemic and the bad that it did. But what my book also focuses on the little parts where we saw benevolence, where we saw hope from people my age. So it makes the difficult situations easy to look on the brighter side.
Nyasa?
I know I'm a little too young to be preaching at the age of 12, but if I have to suggest a few key points, the first would be for people to be more considerate, towards our beautiful planet, our Mother Earth. We should preserve it so that the future generations can also cherish its beauty, not just us. The second message is that everything is good in moderation. Excess of everything is bad. So excess use of technology and social media is also affecting our lives in a very bad way, and we should be aware of it.
Yeah, and that's something I saw in your first story. When I read your first story, it took me sort of a minute to realize that, this is how the future could look like, and this doesn't seem to be a very good future for humanity. But anyway, coming back to all three of you, what are 2 to 4 things that you would like people to learn from your book? I think Nyasa already sort of partly answered that question. So Anushka and Besha, we understand sort of, the themes of trauma and hope and positivity. But are there any specific 2 or 4 things, the 2 to 4 things that you would like people to get from your book?
All right. So I think for my book, when I began writing it, the entire objective was for people, especially the younger generation, to learn about the Kashmir Pandit exodus and acknowledge this historic event, because I feel like it isn't widely spoken about. And a lot of people, especially from the younger generation, don't even know that it happened. And I actually was a part of that group. Despite being a Kashmiri Pandit for the longest time, I didn't even know this was an actual thing. And I didn't really know what exactly transpired. And so largely, I just wanted people to know and acknowledge the event and acknowledge the fact that the Kashmiri Pandit community still continues to live in exile today. And I also, speaking on the same lines of hope and trauma, I wanted to ensure that, the trauma and the pain that they went through doesn't overshadow the Kashmiri Pandit narrative, and I don't want the trauma and the pain and the struggle to become the only thing that's sort of synonymous or associated with the Kashmiri Pandit community. And that's why I was actively also shining light on the fact that this was a story of hope, because, despite everything that's happened, and I also comment on this in my book, the Kashmiri Pandit community still has so much love and respect for for the valley and its people. And so I really want people to take away the fact that this was essentially a story of hope, as opposed to a story of just struggle and trauma and pain.
Grisha, is there anything specific that you would want people to?
Right, yeah. So I think the pandemic changed all of us. And if there's someone reading my book, I'd want them to take away that the pandemic changed us for the better, in the sense that we were humbled into realizing how fragile our existence is. And we were forced to acknowledge that we're all interdependent. And we were also enlightened to the value of family and friends. So.
Nyasa, do you want to add anything to what you already said?
Yeah. So since my childhood, I've been a book lover. I strongly believe that books actually have the power to mold your thoughts, and they can transform your life. I've experienced it personally because I have read some very exceptional authors, like Miss Sudhamurthy's books have taught me empathy, and Mr. Ruskin Bond has convinced me that simplicity has its own charm. And my mother, of course, noticed my love for books, and she motivated me to pen my ideas and observations and write more often. And that's how the journey began.
Wonderful. So that sort of Nyasa's answer gets us to the next question I was going to ask, right? What motivated you to write the book? As we were discussing in our pre-session, it's not common for young people to be of your age to be writing books. I see even where I teach in Alabama, right? Most young people are not even reading books. Forget about writing books. And I'm sure you see that among people around you. So Anushka, we can start with you. What motivated you to write this book?
So I've grown up in Mumbai, so I've lived there my entire life. And I always felt that I was alienated from my Kashmiri Pandit roots because, Kashmir wasn't a subject that we openly spoke about at home. And for the longest time, I didn't understand why. Now I do, because I realize that it is a very, very sensitive topic. And, it's justified now that I've learned so much about, my community's story. But so this book essentially started as a school project, and it was an exploration of, my Kashmiri Pandit identity and, my family as well. And so it essentially started off as a self-exploration, and then it turned into something that was much bigger as, I got into it and learned about the Kashmir Pandit Exodus. So the fact that I never really knew where I came from, I'd never been to Kashmir. I mean, I spoke Kashmiri, I ate Kashmiri food, but that was just about as much as I knew about Kashmir. So it was just this desire and this thirst to learn more about where I came from.
But I'm going to push a little more on that, Anushka, if you don't mind.
For sure.
A lot of people want to, not a lot, but many people come to this age when they want to learn about their roots. But then to sort of take that learning and put it in the form of a book, what motivated you to do that?
So I love to write. And as I said before, this started off as a school project. So I was asked to, channel this exploration into something creative. And I thought, a book would be good because I love to write. And then, of course, this turned into something bigger because I presented a much smaller version of this book in school. And, the response that I got was so overwhelming. Everybody was so supportive. And I realized that if, I can reach so many people through something so small, imagine if I actually published this book and actively went out advocating for my community. And so I think that realization that, this is something I can actually do, was something that pushed me to publish this book.
And would you be willing to share the name of your school?
Oberoi International School.
So let me congratulate, for whatever it is worth, let me congratulate your school for such an interesting project that became the genesis of this very interesting and thought-provoking and eye-opening book. As a teacher, I can tell you that it is very heartening for us to see if we give assignments to students and they take it to the next level like you did. I think that is the best compliment for a teacher. And I'm glad you were at a school where that was encouraged. So your parents made a good choice with your school. Brisha?
Right. So I started writing my book as a daily journal to record my thoughts. And in the beginning, the objective was just to use it as a tool for self-improvement. But as time went by and as the pandemic evolved, before I knew this diary, it became not just a repository of my thoughts, but of everyone my age who felt that their voices need to be heard in times like that. So this eventually compelled me to write my book.
So I'm going to push a little more, if that's okay.
Right, of course.
A lot of young people were stuck in the house in those days, as were your parents and your relatives and your cousins and everyone. And I'm sure a lot of young people, thought a lot about sort of, hey, what just happened to my life? But then what motivated you to put it in words and on paper?
So it was my New Year resolution to write a journal, to write a diary. And as it went on, I didn't realize when my journal became not just mine, but of everyone my age, because the events that were happening in the world at that time were affecting all of us equally. So that's how my journal became something that I wanted to publish, because it became bigger than me and my life.
Okay. Nyasa, I know you already sort of answered partly the question about what motivated you to write this book.
Yeah.
But do you want to add anything?
No, not really. That's all.
Okay. So Nyasa, I'm going to share something with you And I was reading this book by an Indian author. And as I was reading this book, I could not help but be reminded of you. Well, I don't know if you can see it. It's called Higher Than Everest, Memories of a Mountaineer. And the reason it reminded me of you was because this guy was childhood friends with Ruskin Bond. And he describes in the book how he and Ruskin Bond were, used to play together in the mountains. So it reminded me of you. So tell us a little bit about your interest in Ruskin Bond.
I like the simplicity in his stories, basically. He writes very innocent stories about life in the mountains. He tells about children, they're going to school, what they do. He also tells his own childhood stories of when he used to live in the villa. And he has a lot of different types of stories. And of course, I do like them. I've read almost all of his books. And as a person, he's an amazing author, and honestly, I've always taken inspiration from him. So he's my favorite author too.
Wonderful. And when I was reading this book, of all the people it could have reminded me of, it was interesting. It reminded me of you. So I think your book left a good impression, for me for a long time to come. But let's move to the next question. Anushka, will start with you. When you told people you were going to write a book, and be honest about this, what reactions did you get from folks around you? Tell us the good, bad, and the ugly, everything.
So I was 14 when I started writing this book, and that's a young age. I think we can agree on that. I think the fact that I decided to write a book wasn't as surprising to people because I've always been a very creative person. I always, I love making short films. I write a lot of scripts, short stories, etc. But the fact that I chose to write it on such a sensitive and mature topic was something that struck people. And I think that's what made them a little apprehensive about the fact that I was writing a book. And they were like, oh, really, she's doing that? Like, good luck. I think that was the reaction that I got from a lot of people. Because, excuse me, the Kashmir Pandit exodus is a very sensitive and very political issue. And so for a 14-year-old to go and tackle that, it's a big task. And to be fair, I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't completely know what I was getting into when I started off because I was so clueless about the entire thing. But in retrospect, I'm really glad that I did it. As difficult as navigating all of it was, with like the emotional aspect of it and the political aspect of it, I'm really glad I did it. And I'm really glad that, despite there being a few people who were apprehensive of the fact that I was doing this, there were people who were incredibly supportive. And, Mr. Ashok Pandit, Anupam Kherji, all of them were just, even Renu Aunty, they were just so helpful and so incredibly supportive. And I think that really pushed me to do this.
So 2 follow-up questions, if you don't mind. Are you telling me that none of your friends thought you were crazy and no one around you discouraged you?
So the thing is, I kept this a secret for the longest time. That's the thing. So I presented it in school and then I didn't bring it up for the next year and a half, basically. And then when I announced it, people were like, when did you do this? So I think because I kept it a secret, they didn't really have the time to be discouraging because I'd already really done it by the time they found out. But yeah, there were still people who were, I think, just shocked by the fact that I chose to write a book and then chose to write about something that, is so sticky.
And did the movie Kashmir Files have any influence on either your decision to write or the shape that the book eventually took?
So no, so my book came out before Kashmir Files, right? My book came out in July 2021 and Kashmir Files came out this year. So there wasn't really a connection between them.
Got it.
I'm really glad that they did make a movie on this and, this topic got the exposure that it needed.
And did you end up sending them a copy of your book or no?
Yeah, because I've worked so incredibly closely with Anupam Kherji. I was even at the premiere of the movie. It was just a really nice, I think, gathering of people to celebrate, the Kashmir Pandit story and to also just I guess, shine light on the Kashmir Pandit narrative.
Yes, and I would take this opportunity to encourage, hope, request that more people bring out other aspects of this incredible, to be honest, tragedy, but also the hope, right? I mean, both things are very important. So I hope more people will follow in your footsteps and write about this incredible issue. Brisha, you are next. The good, bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. So I was incredibly lucky, actually. Like, everyone around me was very excited, and all I got was motivation. And whenever I felt like, whenever I felt like not doing it, or what kept me going was the reaction that other people were giving me. So like, because I was writing about my daily life and everything, so my friends were really excited because I was like, oh, today I wrote about today, since like, so supposing I write about a day where I met them, so I tell them that, oh, today I'm gonna like write about you, or like, this is what's gonna happen. So they were like, oh my god, so I'm gonna get published soon. So it was a really exciting conversation, and all of them were like my cheerleaders, I'd say. So it was great having people around being so supportive.
And were any of your friends concerned about how you portrayed them in the book?
I didn't get any questions like that, because I think they were sure it would not be something to be concerned about.
Now, your friends were incredibly supportive, but what about parents and the adults in your life, like relatives? I mean, I, like you, have relatives and adults and, people who are older than me, and not every time are they equally supportive.
For me, they were equally supportive. In fact, my parents, they were always there for me. My mother was there to guide me and help me through it. She used to read my manuscript. My grandparents were like, they were so excited. They used to send these messages on the family group saying this is happening. And so everything was great. Everyone was really supportive.
That's very good to hear, and I'm glad that's how it worked out. Now, as I was reading the book, I thought, so for me at least, one of the positive things about your book was you didn't seem to be pointing fingers at anyone. Like, if you read sort of the discussion in the global media about the pandemic, the Americans are pointing fingers at the Chinese are pointing fingers at the Americans, they're blaming each other. But your book sort of avoids all that blame game. Was that a conscious decision?
Yeah, partly, yeah. But also, like, my focus when I was writing the book was not, so when the pandemic was going on, all the things we would hear, see on the news, was all like opinions of all the professionals in the world, but the voices and views of people like us had been drowned in that. So my book was mainly about highlighting that and bringing that forward. So yeah.
And I want to let you know how much I enjoyed that aspect of your book. I was like waiting, okay, when is the finger pointing going to start? And then when it didn't start, I was like, this is good. This is how a young person should be writing. So I was very happy to see that. And I must say, there's many college students, because that's my, my typical sort of students that I deal with, who don't have that maturity that you showed in not going into finger pointing. Even so, my point is, even much older students than you sometimes don't have that maturity. So that's good. Nyasa, do you want to share?
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So to be honest, I didn't plan it as a book from the very start. I just started writing stories when I was like around in 5th grade or 6th grade, like during the pandemic. So then when I've written a bunch of stories, my mom suggested the idea of actually getting them published. So that's when I decided to make it a book. So nobody exactly knew. But once I told them that I was actually in the process of writing the book, they were mostly like, you've got to be kidding me. You're actually writing a book? So that was the most common expression. I mean, they didn't exactly believe me in the beginning, but yes, I mean, I don't blame them. It's a little hard to believe a 10 or 11-year-old kid is writing a book, so.
Yeah, and was anyone sort of like discouraging?
No, nobody discouraged me. Everybody was supporting.
Now you say that your favorite story in the book is The Perfect 10.
That is true.
Tell us a little bit about it, and then I'll tell you which one my favorite story in your book is.
Okay, so The Perfect 10 is emphasizing on the fact that life is actually a recipe. you need a little bit of this, a little bit of that to actually make it complete. There's intelligence, determination, and compassion. And I believe these three are important qualities, which I have tried to inculcate in the story. So Pihu is a young girl who basically has this gift. Whoever has a 10 on all three of these criteria has a special power to see other people's scores, and then they must help the other person. So when Pihu's grandma dies, she gives the gift to Pihu, who goes around helping different people. And this is a story of how she helps them and how they also reach the heights of success, just like her.
And I must say, I enjoyed reading that story very much. And when I read that it was your favorite story, I thought, oh, that's a good choice. Now, I must say that my favorite story in your book was the first story, where you talk about the future where, people will be so used to living indoors because of, I guess, several reasons, that having a friend and hanging out outside with them would be strange and alien to people. So what got you thinking about that story?
Well, of course, like I love nature and I've always been, little more outgoing. I've always supported going outside. I always go to the mountains and I just love traveling. So when I heard that our environment is being harmed so much, I knew I had to do something about it. So I tried to imagine what it would be if we continued like this for the next decade or so, or maybe like the next century, then that might be the outcome. That might actually become the truth. So I was a little concerned about that. So I decided to write it down to, spread a little more awareness about it, I guess.
Wonderful. And so we go back to Anushka now with the question of, when you started writing this book, did it all go as planned? Or were there challenges that you had not anticipated? We hold the finished product in our hand, and of course we hold it and we think, oh, this must have been easy. And so, Anushka?
Right. I think with everything, there will be challenges and there will be things that don't go your way. I think the biggest challenge that I faced was finding photos, because my book is a coffee table book. So I wrote a lot, but there were also a lot of pictures and a lot of paintings to help, people understand the Kashmir Pandit story and really paint an accurate picture of it. But the thing was that the Kashmir Pandit exodus was largely a very undocumented event because of how sticky the entire situation was and the politics that were involved. There weren't a lot of, the media at the time didn't really cover the exodus at the level that you would expect them to. And so for me, finding photos and, just digging through the archives is something that was incredibly difficult because I wasn't being able to find anything for the longest time. And I'm going to be honest with you, that did freak me out a bit, because I really wanted there to be pictures and sort of a visual element to the book to help sort of build this world that I was trying to immerse my audience in. But, I had the incredible team at Vizasta Publishing helping me. I had my parents, and we all sort of just pushed and reached out to sources around the world and got, the beautiful pictures and paintings that finally made it in the book.
So when you say archives, I'm assuming, and, I travel frequently to India. I'm there about 4 months a year. I assume that there are no set archives where you go and get these pictures in India, correct? You had to source them through your personal network. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, there are also some sources, like there are, photographers, and there are also painters who were, working at the time and their personal works. And, I actively sort of researched people who, would have perhaps documented that and then reached out to them. So by archives, I just generally mean things that were, written or documented or photographed or painted at the time or in the past.
And as you did this sort of reaching out to get the photographs or to dig into the personal archives of people, what role did the adults in your life, whether that be your parents or their friends or your publisher, what role did the adults play in that process?
I think a lot of it was self-driven, where I actively reached out to people. Like I would be emailing them, I would be DMing them on Instagram. I would actively be going out and meeting them. But I think my parents were really helpful in the fact where they were like, oh, you should try reaching out to this person. Or my father, because he's also from the same industry, he was like, oh, this person might be helpful. Here's their contact, speak to them. With Ask the Publishing as well, I think they also made an active and conscious effort to reach out to people on their end and use, their contacts and people that they perhaps knew or thought would have paintings and photos that would be helpful to me. Yeah, but I think the role that both my parents as well as with Ask the Publishing played in this journey was also in sort of comforting me when I wasn't finding anything, because for the longest time I didn't. The photos and the paintings were like the very last thing that came into place. And so I think they were constantly sort of just reassuring me, but like, it's okay, keep going. You have it under control. Because I really, really wanted there to be a visual element. And I'm really glad that fell into place eventually.
And I think that also makes the book appealing to a younger audience. People at my age, we can read books like this that are all text and no pictures. But young people, need some pictures to sort of keep them engaged, usually. So I think that played a role too. And of course, being a coffee table book, you need pictures. So Brisha, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So I think the year 2020 was like a roller coaster of emotions, and there was so much happening together. There was a point in the year when my family and people in my house got COVID. So while the emotional ecosystem wasn't always very sound, and there were days where I didn't feel like writing, but I think and I did take breaks in the middle, but I think what kept me going was the stories that I saw blooming among whatever was going on. For example, the story of Jyoti Kumari, who cycled kilometers to like bring her father home, to all the small shopkeepers and vendors who were affected by the pandemic, but still making do with their limited resources, the migrant crisis. And, when things like this were going on, I was like, yes, I have to write about this. Like, it has to be documented. So that's how it was.
And Brisha, are you telling me that during the whole year, your own family did not face any crisis that would have sort of discouraged a lesser motivated person?
No, it did. So when my family was first affected by COVID, it was still very new. So people were still figuring it out, what do we do? What are the exact medicines to bring home? How do you deal with this? So while all of that was going on, obviously you weren't in the best frame of mind to just sit down and write. But I think that's when writing and journaling became my outlet to like put down the chaos and like, write it down to figure it out for yourself, sort of a thing. So that's what helped me.
And what about all the distractions? Like you could have been playing video games, you could have been, watching TV, you could have been messaging your friends, but you were writing.
For me, I think when there's something at hand, and like the way to distract myself is like first, sort of dealing with it and then like indulging in something else. So the situation at hand was so big that, you couldn't get your mind off it and do anything else without just constantly thinking about it. So that's why I never really got off writing so much. But like I said, there were times when I had to take breaks because it wasn't the best frame of mind to do so, to write.
Yeah, it's a stressful topic, even though, your book is positive, but I mean, the whole topic is stressful. And if you're writing about it, you have to make sure you follow it even more on TV, which makes it even more depressing. So yeah, wonderful. So Nyasa, any challenges that you had not anticipated?
So as I earlier said, of course, I didn't intend to write it as a book. I just started writing stories. And then, of course, I decided to compile them together into a book. Actually, my mom decided it, but then we got it published and all. But honestly, I didn't have any challenges. I did have long discussions with my parents about nature, climate change, and other current issues, which are an important part of my book. And then I had more time basically to explore my thoughts, make observations, and pen down my thoughts, of course. So it all just turned out in the form of some stories,
Yeah, so Nyasa, I'm a professor, so I've written several books, and when people ask me where my love for books come from, I tell them my mother. So when I read in your book sort of, how much your mother played a big role in this, I thought, good to have these supportive, constructive mothers in our life, right, who encourage us towards these positive activities. And so what were some things where, you may have been, I don't know, and your mother was like, keep going?
Yes, there was a small point when I did get a little dismotivated. Of course, I didn't write it as a book, but then when I did figure out in the middle it could become a book, I tried a bit harder, but then there were days I didn't feel like writing because like not all days are the same. But then my mom was like, Nyasa, you have to keep going on. So then she used to encourage me to write more often. She used to encourage me to write more. So yes, my mom did play a key part in this.
Good. And that's a very insightful observation you made. For a writer, not all days are the same. And I think that's very important for sort of budding writers, young writers, emerging writers to understand. Okay, let's move to the next question. Anushka, how long did it take you to write the book? And how did you keep yourself on track and motivated during this time, especially with, running into the kind of roadblocks you did and, the challenges you did? How did you keep yourself motivated?
So I started writing this book when I was 14 and I ended up publishing it when I was 16. So that was 2 years worth of work that went into it. I'm not gonna lie, like in retrospect, it's a very, very long time. And I still sometimes am surprised that I went through with it and kept pushing. Because there were a lot of factors in my life that, could have easily distracted me. I was also, in 11th and 12th grade, I was doing the International Baccalaureate, I had college applications, schoolwork as well. With the pandemic, it was all very hectic. But I think Nyasa and Brish have spoken about this. For me, writing was an outlet as well. It was a break from everything else. Again, as I said before, it started off as this entire journey of self-exploration. And so that itself, the idea that I was learning more about myself and my community and my culture and my family just kept pushing me to, keep on researching and keep on writing. And I'm going to be honest with you, there was a lot of rewriting that went into this book because the one that you have in your hand now is very different from the one that I initially written for my school. And so I honestly didn't mind the rewriting because I'd also grown so much in those 2 years. And I feel like I had changed as a writer, I'd changed as a person. And so when it came to rewriting, I actually was pretty on track with it and was willing to do it because I felt like I had so much more to contribute.
Yeah, so, we teach writing to the younger generation here in the university. And the hardest part to teach, I think, is the rewriting part. Because people think that writing is sort of a linear process. You start from the first sentence and you're done with the last sentence. And teaching them that then you have to go back and keep iterating and keep rewriting and keep improving. That's very difficult to teach even students who are, maybe double your age. So it's interesting for me to hear that you sort of got to that stage on your own. Or was it your parents who sort of guided you on the rewriting part?
No, I actually just read my work and I was like, no, I don't like this very much. And so I just kept on. I'm very critical of my work. And I am a perfectionist, and the team at the task had to keep telling me, it's fine at this point, you can like let it go, because after you can't keep reworking it and reworking it because it's an endless cycle. You have to stop at some point. And for me, I think the challenge was to find that point where I would stop and sort of distance myself from the work and be like, okay, this is it. But because I wrote it over the course of 2 years, I think there was a lot of opportunity for me to rewrite and sort of edit my work.
Yeah, and that's the other difficult thing we find to teach young people. When I say young, I include even 30-year-olds as young, is the self-editing thing, like how difficult it is to self-edit. And so I am very glad to hear that, you ended up in that sort of stage on your own. So that's good. Brisha?
Right. So for me, my book was a journal of an entire year. So in 2020, in the beginning, I started writing it. And in the middle, somewhere where I figured out, okay, yeah, this can become something, a collection. So I went writing throughout the year, and it took a chunk of the next year as well to get everything together, to talk to everyone, to get the cover and like the final finished product together. So It was, I think, a span of about 1.5 years. And like Anushka said, like not knowing where to stop is one very big problem, because like for me, like my year, like the diary entries capture the entire year 2020. But then after that, I had like a conclusion sort of a thing at the end, because the pandemic was moving so fast, and by the end of 2020 till a few months into 2021, so much had happened. So the end on which I ended my book had completely changed, because the things were happening so fast. So I was, every time it got a few days delayed, I was like, I want to write more, because this is not what it is at this point. So that was one difficult thing. Where do I stop, where do I put an end to this? But yeah, so it all happened in a span of 1.5 years, and everything got together in that time.
And when you say you struggled with deciding where to stop and when to finish it, were those decisions you ended up making, or did your parents or other people sort of help you make that decision?
No, so it was like everyone, even my parents were like, it's your decision. But I think what pushed it was the deadlines I had to meet. Like it had to go into printing and all of that. So before all of that happened, you really want it to be consolidated and you want to be content with it. So I think all of those deadlines pushed it. It was like, okay, yeah, this is it. Yeah, this is where we leave it.
Nyasa?
So, of course, I'd said it earlier, I didn't intend to write it as a book. And it took me around 1.5 years, of course. And you can also notice that I was a little less mature when I started out in like 5th grade. And I got a little more mature like till the end of 6th grade. So you can also notice that earlier I wrote a bit more fiction. Then I started writing a little bit more futuristic. And, so yes, that change is a little bit noticeable. So yeah, it took me around 1.5 years to write it, not including the publishing.
I like how you say when you started, you were a little less mature, and when you finished, you were more mature. Believe me, from my perspective and where I am in age, all three of you are, young and writing about topics that are sort of very serious and mature. So yeah, I'm very pleased to see that. So okay, let's move on to before we move on to the next question, let's ask the audience if they have any questions to ask. So we have some wonderful people in the audience. Anybody questions? If you have questions, we would invite you to ask on video. Okay, so I'll keep going then. One of the things we ask all our authors at this point is to share with us who were the senior writers who inspired you. I know Nyasa already talked about Ruskin Bond, but beyond that, and those of our audiences who might not know Ruskin Bond, let me remind them that he is an Indian citizen who lives in India and is a Padma winner. He is very well acclaimed Indian author. And others, who are the writers who've inspired you so far?
For me, Ismat Chugtai has been a very, very big sort of literary influence. After reading her anthology of short stories, The Quilt, I was just extremely taken aback in a good way by her writing. Of course, it was written in Urdu, and I read the English translation of it. But just the fact that her writing sort of transcends these barriers of language and religion was something that really struck a chord with me. And I want to be a writer whose stories, transcend these cultural barriers. I also just really, really admired the fact that she wrote about such mature, sensitive, taboo topics in a time where nobody wanted to, explore these issues, given the time and era she was born in. Another literary influence for me is Siddharth Gigu sir. I met him at the Gulmarg Literary Fest last year when I was invited to speak, and he has been, a mentor of mine. He's been so supportive of my work. He's written a lot about the Kashmir Pandit community as well. And I think that's where we essentially bonded. And I'm just really, really I just find it really incredible that he himself has devoted so much of his writing and so much of his art to the Kashmir Pandit community and continues to support young authors like me.
So, Anushka, let me tell you that it's not often that the answer from a young 18-year-old embarrasses me, but in this case it does, because I have to admit that I have not read Ismat Chugtai. I know who about her work and all that, but I have not read, and I am embarrassed. And so now I'm going to make it a point to read. But I missed the second author you talked about. So could you share with us?
Siddharth Gigu, sir. He's another Kashmiri Pandit author. He's written, books like A Long Dream of Home, and they're about the Kashmiri Pandit community and their story as well. And I got to meet him in person and talk to him and bond with him over, our work and our sort of passion for advocating for the Kashmiri Pandit community through our work.
Wonderful. Brisha?
For me, I think The Diary of Anne Frank was also a book, a journal that was written in the world during the Second World War. And when I discovered that this is what I want to do with my diary entries, I figured out the connection, because even that's just a set of diary entries so about her life and about what was going on, but it gives us a lens into what was going on in the world and not just what was going on into her life. And I felt like that was something, because that book was so well known, it was something that pushed me to write because of how I recognized how similar the situation was. So I was inspired by her book.
Wonderful. Nyasa?
I had partly answered that question when I said Mr. Ruskinbon, but I do feel inspired by Mr. Ruskinbon. Also, some other authors are Ms. Sudhamurthy, and also to some extent Mr. Robin Sharma. And I also have read many wonderful books by authors like Ms. J.K. Rowling, Mr. Roald Dahl, Ms. Enid Blyton, just to name a few.
So Robin Sharma, of course, most people know, but could you tell us a little bit about Damodaran, you said?
I didn't say that.
Who did you name before Robin Sharma?
Ms. Sudhamurthy.
Sudhamurthy. Okay. Could you tell us about, a little bit about her? Many people may not know about her books. They may know her as the wife of Narayan Murthy, but they may not know her books. Could you tell a little bit about her?
So she writes stories about empathy. She writes stories about kindness. She has very simple stories, of course, but her stories are also reflecting about, the issues, and then how simple people actually, with their kindness, help everyone. So I've only read a few stories written by her, and I can see that reflected in all of her stories, actually.
And for those of you who are interested in, Sudhamurthy, there's also she's also on Netflix now. One of her books, I think, has been made into sort of a Netflix series, like for children. So, if you're interested, you can take a look. But I think we have a question from Navisha for our panelists. Navisha, do you want to ask?
When you started writing books?
So the question is, when did you start writing your books? At what age? The three of you, could you answer that for her, please?
I started writing when I was 14 years old.
And that was the first time you were writing a book?
A book? Yeah, I've been writing from a very young age.
Like what age?
I would say like 8, 9.
8.
Yeah.
Okay. Brisha?
Yeah, so for me too, I've been writing since I was about 8 years old. But writing this book, as I said, was a New Year resolution. So it began when I was 13 in 2020. And yeah.
Nyasa?
I started writing this book when I was 10 and a half, but I've been writing ever since I was like 8 or 9 too.
So it seems like 8 is the time when people start writing. I'd never thought about that, but it's interesting how 8 seems to be the common age here. And I'm going to dig more into it if there's any research on this topic on when people start writing.
Okay.
Tanishk, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, all these brilliant panelists, if they're already working on their next books, and what are those going to be about, and when are they coming out?
So Tanishq, you stole our next question, but that's all right. So before we ask other questions, can you answer Tanishq questions on what is the next book you're working on, if any?
So I am currently at film school right now in New York. So I'm not just working on next book, I'm working on scripts, I'm working on short films, I'm actively working on a lot of projects right now. But there is a book that will come soon. I won't tell you what it is right now, but there will be something. I'll tell you that.
Now I'm going to push a little bit on this, and it's okay, you want to keep it secret, but I'm going to push. I'm going to do sort of what Amitabh Bachchan does on KBC. Is the book about your life in New York?
It is not about my life in New York, but
Is
I'm
the
not going
book-
to tell you what it is about because I think it's just so much more fun if I keep it a secret.
That's fine. I can still push in the Amitabh Bachchan style. Is the book about Kashmiri Pandits?
No, but
Okay.
let's just say it's not too different from what I've done before. Like you will see the similarities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grisha.
So for me, I think what I took from journaling and writing this book was introspection. So right now I'm just writing small excerpts about, about myself and understanding what goes around me, what processes go around me. So I think, yeah, that's what I'm working on. I think I'm also working on myself as a writer, and yeah.
Grisha, let me, as I said to you, I'm in my 40s, mid 40s, and I am still working on myself as a writer. So that's a process that never finishes. My mentor, who was about 65 when he retired, the last book he was reading when he retired was How to Become a Better Writer. And I was like, you are about to retire. And he says, that doesn't mean I stopped trying to become a better writer. So we are all in that process. But did I hear you say that the next book you're working on will also be in this spirit of sort of autobiographical, or sort of your own journey?
So to be honest, I haven't really thought about compiling anything as such into another book, but for now, what I am writing about is what about myself and what I see around me and the processes around me. So yeah.
Wonderful. Nyasa?
Yeah, so could you please repeat the question one more time?
What's the next book you're working on?
So I do have some ideas, but nothing has crystallized yet. I've just shifted to the US, and technically school life, homework, I don't have a lot of time to work on a book. During the COVID pandemic, I did have some time, but I don't have that time anymore. So I will have to figure out, a better time to start writing a book.
And Nyasa, will the next book be about the life of an Indian 7th grade student in California, or will it be not about you?
You actually read my mind. That was what I was thinking about.
Tanishq, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. So my next question to the panelist is, what books are you reading these days?
So I have gone on an Indian mytho craze. I've started reading books by Amish, like The Immortals of Meluha. It's very different from the kind of content I've typically consumed. And so far, it's been really interesting.
And Anushka, I will add that I also got some of those books a few years back to read, and it was very different from everything else I'd read. And I thought, wow, this is just a whole different side of literature that I had never, looked into. And in some ways, I thank Dan Brown for sort of, this interest in this kind of work, right? I mean, that's how I sort of thought of, Amish as like, the Indian Dan Brown, if you will, in that way. Is that sort of your sense too?
Yeah, I see the connection now that you make it. But like mythology has always been something I've been interested in, but never quite had the opportunity to explore. And I feel now that I'm in the US, it's a great way to still keep in touch with home and just be connected to Indian culture, because it's always nice to still sort of, be connected to your roots.
Right, right. And New York, of course, there's a large Indian community.
Oh yeah, it's great. I
Grisha?
feel very much at home. Yeah.
Yeah. Visha?
Yeah, so Nyasa mentioned a lot of authors that I've grown up reading. Like, there was so many familiar names like Roald Dahl, Sudhamurti, R.K. Narayan, and I've grown up reading all of them. But like as of now, I think there's no specific type, but I love spending my time in bookstores. Just looking at different books and exploring what's there. So some of the books that I've read of late are Invisible Woman, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, then The Last Queen. Yeah, just to name a few.
So tell us about The Last Queen, if you will.
Yeah, it's an Indian author, and it's about like her novel is basically.
I think we lost her. So Nyasa, could you answer that, and maybe we'll have her back?
Of course. So currently I'm reading The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari by Mr. Robin Sharma. So that's where it came from. And the last book I finished was The Keeper of the Lost Cities by Miss Shannon Messenger.
And tell us about The Keeper of the Lost Cities.
Yeah, it's like a book about a girl who wants to find her identity. She's always been very different, and she actually finds out that she's an elf. Yes, I am into fantasy right now. And yeah, I do start reading different types of books in different times. So I am revisiting that fantasy. And then she figures out that she's actually a telepath and she can read minds. Then she trains herself and she makes friends in this new world. She has never been in the elven world. So there's a lot for her to learn, but she's actually exceptional in her studies, and she discovers a second ability of her, infliction, which is basically you can cause someone pain just by thinking. So there's a group that is targeting her. They actually made her as a superpower weapon who could destroy anything or something.
Wonderful. Brisha, I think we lost you earlier, so could you?
Yeah. So as I was saying, The Last Queen. So what I found interesting in that book was it encapsulated a lot of relationships. Like it was a love story. It taught us about love and betrayal, but it also taught us about a bond between a mother and a child. So I feel like all of this being brought through a historical story was something really great to read.
And which queen is that about?
I'm just one second.
Did we lose you again, or are you still there with us? Okay, we might have lost her again. So let me ask you one last question, and then sort of we are close to the end of time here. But as I was prepping for this interview, I could not help think we have voices from three incredibly wonderful young girls on three different very different topics. And each of these books is so interesting, so sort of fascinating. But where are the male voices on these issues? So, you all have cousins, and maybe you have brothers, and maybe you have, boys who study in your classes, who study with you in college or whatever. Where are the male voices on these issues? Do you see a gender gap in sort of writing or reading? Is it just sort of, are we missing the male voices, I guess is my question.
I don't think I hope not that there's this thing where only female writers are writing books. I really hope there isn't a gap, because as we had discussed before we started the interview, that I think it's just really important for young people to write in general, and it would be great if more young authors publish their work and share their points of views, because it's just so refreshing to hear younger voices, because I feel like most of the works that we read as readers are written by adults, and so it's just a refreshing perspective to have. But to answer your question, all I think I can say is that I hope not. I hope there isn't a gap or a disconnect as such.
So are there boys around you, people who you're going to college with, men, boys in your family who are writing books like you did?
Now that I've come here at film school, everybody's a creator, right? Everybody's writing. I mean, we're not writing books, but we're still writing a lot, and everybody's constantly working on their craft. So over here, I think the environment is very concentrated in that sense, and everybody's sort of focused on achieving the same thing. So it's a great creative environment to be in as a writer, as a storyteller, as someone who wants to work in the film industry. But I definitely felt that back home, there weren't as many guys who were actively writing. I think that for all three of us, journaling was something that, is something that our writing stemmed from. And I feel that journaling is something that girls tend to do more than guys. So I think that's where, for younger authors, at least, the writing sort of passion and urge to write comes from. So to answer your question, I think maybe it's just that.
Good. So Brisha, did you get my question? Like, where are the male voices, or, where are the boys your age writing on these very important topics? And do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Sorry, can you repeat your question? I got cut off in the middle.
Yeah, I did notice that. So my question is, all three of you, incredible girls who are writing these fascinating books, but, you maybe have brothers, you have cousins, you have, other boys your age in your school. Where are the male voices on these important issues? Do you see a gender gap in who's writing?
So I think I agree with what Anushka just said. Like, for me personally, the people I know, I see how girls are more more towards writing and journaling. So I feel like that way there is a gap. But I also don't feel like I feel like it even got like of course I've read male authors, and of course I have friends who write. So it's just the females are more in number, especially for the people like around me.
Wonderful. Nyasa?
Yeah, I do agree with Anushka and Brescia. Same thing. Yes, girls do tend to journalize a little bit more. They also tend to be a little more, they tend to read a little bit more than boys. Boys are more into let's go play outside and eat some pizza. But girls tend to write a little bit more. So that journaling turns into stories, stories turn into books. So that's what I feel too.
Wonderful. We have another question from Ajit. So if you don't mind, I know we are past time, but we'll take one last question and then we'll wrap it up. So Ajit, do you want to ask your question? Ajit Kumar? I think we don't have his question. So on that note, let me say how incredibly good my day has started today, because I got a chance to talk to the three of you and learn about your journeys as authors and more about sort of the people behind your book, people behind the books that you wrote. Do you have any piece of advice for budding authors who may be thinking of writing but haven't done yet? Anushka?
Yeah, I think we touched upon this earlier. Brisha was speaking about how, every day as an author, isn't the same. Everything is every day is gonna be different. And I think my piece of advice is to just keep writing, even if you feel like your writing isn't good enough, or if you feel like you don't have anything worth sharing. I promise that you do. And I promise that you actually can write it. I think all three of us are testament to the fact that, your writing does matter, and it's something that you can actually do. So yeah, just keep writing. And I think the only way you can also improve yourself as an author and as a person is to just keep writing.
Brisha?
I completely agree with what she said. I also believe that I believe that creative expression is like transformative, and what I practice the most is writing. So I feel like anyone thinking about it should definitely go for it. And I also feel like even if what you're writing is not relevant to you in the moment, a lot of times you'll come back to it and you'll feel like you can use it somewhere. It'll lead you to think further. So I feel like nothing is worth just scrapping out and discarding.
Nyasa?
I also feel the same way. Even if you're writing just 15 minutes a day, you're improving yourself. So of course, as Anushka said, if you want to get better at writing, you have to keep writing. So even if you write a little bit every day, you will get better at it. And if you have an idea, bring it together. You can write a book. Everyone can write a book. Actually, I was not special. Everyone is special. So you have something in you. If you have an idea, you can do it. Write a book.
Wonderful. On that note, thank you very much. Namaste, and I am very fortunate that we got to talk to you today. Have a good day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.